He was 81, not frail, but weathered, like an old oak tree that had seen too many winters. His hands trembled slightly, the kind of tremble that doesn't come from weakness but from time itself. Veins like old riverbeds, skin thin as parchment, but his grip still held meaning. His eyes, dimmed by age, still flickered with something ancient and unspoken. Not anger, not self-pity. Something more haunting, something that made you lean in. And then he spoke. The room, filled with caregivers, volunteers, and a few other elders, fell still. But this wasn't silence out of politeness. It was suspension. Because in that moment, we all felt it in our gut. He's about to say something that will stay with us forever. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clear his throat. He simply said, "I wasn't a bad husband, but I was a distracted one, and distraction is how love dies." It hit like a thunderclap, but no one flinched, because deep down, we recognized that truth. There was no cheating, no betrayal, no screaming matches at 2 a.m., just decades of small silences, missed glances, autopilot conversations over dinner, empty rituals mistaken for connection. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away 3 years ago, peacefully, in her sleep. He had held her hand that night, but the tragedy? He hadn't really looked into her eyes in over a decade, not seen her, not noticed the way she stirred her tea with 2 slow circles before speaking, not noticed when she started wearing that green sweater more often, his favorite color, not asked why her laugh had grown quieter, more brittle. And then he said it, slowly, carefully, like every syllable was an open wound. "You don't lose someone when they die. You lose them when you stop seeing them." Silence again. But now it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that squeezes the chest. Because suddenly, everyone in that room was asking themselves the same terrifying question. When was the last time I truly saw the person I love? He looked around. His voice grew steadier now, like the truth had finally caught fire in him. Most people think love ends in explosions, fights, cheating, screaming. But that's just the funeral. The death happened years before, in the quiet. He leaned forward, his voice a whisper that somehow echoed. It's when dinner turns into duty. When good morning becomes a reflex, not a connection. When you stop being curious about who they're becoming. We all shifted in our chairs, not from discomfort, from recognition. He didn't cry, but the pain in his voice was sharper than tears. And then, with a long pause that made time freeze, he finished. "You'll think you have time. You don't. Regret lasts longer than grief. Much longer." Then he leaned back, and that was it. The lesson wasn't in the words. It was in the space between them. That's when the tears came. Not from pity, but from the deep, paralyzing realization that we might be doing the exact same thing, right now. He wasn't trying to frighten anyone. There was no raised voice, no dramatic tone, just calm, deliberate truth, the kind that creeps under your skin and stays there. But make no mistake, what he said was terrifying. Because sometimes fear is the only thing that wakes people up when sleepwalking through love. He told us about his neighbor, Glenn. A familiar story, on the surface. Married 52 years, 2 kids, a modest home. On Sundays, they trimmed the hedges together. On Wednesdays, they watched game shows in silence. People said, "What a stable couple." Then, one Tuesday morning, without a fight, without a single tear, Glenn's wife quietly packed a suitcase and walked out the front door. No yelling, no dramatic exit, just a handwritten note left on the kitchen table. 6 words. I'm tired of being invisible. That note landed like a funeral bell, not just for Glenn, for everyone who ever assumed routine equals happiness. She moved 2 towns over to a senior co-living community, a smaller space, shared walls. But she started painting again. She said she felt seen for the first time in decades. Glenn was devastated. He begged to know why she never told him she was unhappy. And that's when she delivered the final blow, calm, emotionless. I did. 1,000 times. You just weren't listening. And that is what should terrify you. Because here's the truth most people don't want to face. Someone in your life may have already said those exact words, not out loud, but through withdrawal, through silence, through 1,000 small disappointments. You just didn't hear them. You weren't listening. And that's what the old man was trying to tell us. Not through anecdotes, through a warning, cold, precise, unavoidable. Emotional neglect, he said, isn't a metaphor. It's pain, real pain, as real as a broken bone. It doesn't scream. It accumulates. He paused, looked straight ahead as if addressing someone no longer in the room. Every time you choose the TV over a real conversation, you're making a withdrawal. Every night you scroll past your partner's eyes, you're saying, "You're not worth my presence." And every time you assume they're fine, you're adding to a silence that will one day become permanent. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down, because the mirror had been raised, and what it reflected wasn't pretty. Then, with a quiet, almost reverent tone, he dropped the line that scorched the room. We assume love is a feeling, but at 81, I know better. Love is presence, and when you leave the room emotionally, that's when the goodbye begins. Let that sit for a second. Let it wrap itself around your chest, because if your partner has grown distant lately, less patient, less warm, less interested, ask yourself, are they just tired? Just moody? Or are they already halfway gone? Already imagining life without your silence? Already choosing a version of peace where they no longer have to beg to be seen? This wasn't just a story about Glenn. It was a caution sign, bright red, screaming into the quiet spaces of your own life. If you're not listening now, someday, no one will be speaking. There's a slow kind of decay that happens after 60, not just in the body, not just in the joints or the eyesight, but in the attention you give and the attention you receive. It starts quietly. A conversation you meant to finish, but didn't. A compliment you thought about giving, but kept to yourself. A touch you withheld because there's always tomorrow. But the decay is real. And if you ignore it, it becomes irreversible. That's what the old man was trying to make us understand. He wasn't preaching. He wasn't blaming. He was begging. He told another story, this one quieter, but somehow even darker. His name was Harold, 77 years old, a former truck driver, 2 grown sons, a marriage that had lasted 48 years. And then, a stroke. He lost his ability to speak. His right arm hung limp. He couldn't feed himself, couldn't write. But he waited, day after day, in the rehab center, watching the door, waiting for his wife. She never came. Not once. When asked why, she answered with the cold precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. I spent 4 decades being his shadow. He never once asked how I felt. Now he knows what silence feels like. That line haunted the room. And it should haunt you, too, because that's what happens when you don't notice the damage while it's still repairable. You might think, but I never did anything wrong. And maybe that's true. But you need to understand, you don't have to hit someone to hurt them. You just have to stop seeing them. Every moment you say later instead of tell me now. Every sigh when they try to speak. Every glance at your phone during dinner. It all adds up. Not into anger. Not even into resentment. Into emptiness. The old man looked around and said, almost in a whisper, "Most people don't realize they're losing someone until they've already been replaced by silence." Then he looked us in the eye, one by one, and gave us what he called the checklist of slow heartbreak. When was the last time you said thank you without being prompted? When was the last time you asked how their day really felt, not just what happened? When was the last time you touched their hand without needing a reason? If you can't remember, you might already be living in the echo of a relationship that's halfway gone. Love, he said, isn't a firework. It's a candle. You don't need to blow it out to lose it. Just stop tending the flame. That sentence? It didn't just hurt, it terrified. Because the people we think will always be there usually aren't. Not because they left, but because we stopped showing up. He leaned back, looked down at his frail hands, and said with brutal honesty, "People don't die when their heart stops. They die when no one checks if it's still beating." Let that settle. Because if you're thinking, "But I'm doing my best," maybe you are. But maybe you're not doing what matters most. He sat quietly for a moment, eyes lowered. You could feel the weight in his silence. Not dramatic, just heavy. It was the weight of someone who had lived through the collapse and survived just long enough to regret it. He didn't rush what he said next. He didn't need to. "I outlived my wife by 3 years," he finally said. "But truth is, I started missing her 10 years before she died. Not because she left him, but because he left first, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. He had still come home every night, paid the bills, mowed the lawn, sat next to her on the couch. But he wasn't with her. Not where it mattered." He paused again. You could hear a pin drop. Even the air seemed to still itself, waiting for what came next. "In the part that breaks me the most," he whispered. "She never asked me to stay present. She just waited. Until she couldn't wait anymore. That is what broke the room. Not the story of a loud divorce, but of a quiet disappearance, the kind that happens while everyone is still living under the same roof." Then he leaned forward, and what he said next was not gentle. It was a mirror. "You're so sure they'll be there tomorrow, that you'll have more time to fix it. But you won't. Old age doesn't come with a siren. It doesn't yell, it whispers. And one day, you'll wake up and realize you've forgotten how to love the person sitting right next to you." And then he gave the room its last, final wound. Most people don't get second chances. They get silence, or a funeral, or a goodbye letter you'll read 1,000 times and never fully understand. So what do? You act. You stop waiting for the perfect moment. You stop assuming they know how I feel. You stop choosing distraction over depth. You take their hand. You look them in the eyes, and you say it. "I see you. I'm sorry. Thank you for staying. Tell me everything I've stopped asking about." And if you're already alone, then you speak to the people still in your life. You write the letter you never sent. You forgive the ones who hurt you. But more importantly, you forgive yourself for not being the person you could have been. Because shame never heals, but presence does. The old man stood up, slowly, and before he walked out, he gave us the last sentence, the one people would talk about long after the room was empty. "If you have someone, love them like you're running out of time. Because you are." And with that, he left. Not with drama, not with applause, just the truth echoing in our chest, like a clock ticking louder than ever.